of John, and we're in our seventh message. Ron eloquently did the wedding ceremony. And if you will, if you haven't done this already, go ahead and mark in your Bibles John chapter 2, 1 through 11, 1 through 12. Mark that as the first miracle of John, because there's going to be 7 altogether and 6. It's a way to count down. Just like the passage that we're looking at today, John chapter 2, 13 to 22, you can write this down. This is the first of 3 Passovers that we'll see in John. Tells you Jesus lived for 33 years. 3 of his years were in ministry, and this is his first year in ministry that the Passover is taking place. His last Passover, obviously, is when he is crucified. And so if you will, go ahead and put that down, mark it. Just a little bit of added functionality there, added information. Let me go ahead and do the slides here because I'm doing the slides. And here we go. You know, as we look at the passage before us, there's a lot of things that come to my mind, questions that come to my mind. But one of the things I think about is the story of Goldilocks. Who as a kid remember Goldilocks? I got a couple kids in here that remember Goldilocks. Story of a little girl that goes out in the woods, gets lost, come across a house. She goes into the house, breaking into it, and I'm adding, obviously, some emphasis to it. Sees porridge sitting on the table, starts tasting the porridge. One's too hot, one's too cold. One is just right. She eats it all up, steals the porridge. Then she goes upstairs to the bedroom. She's sleepy from eating all the porridge. And she goes into the bedrooms. She sees 3 beds. One's too hard, one's too soft. One is just right, and so she makes her way, going to sleep, and then all of a sudden, the owners of the house come home, the 3 bears looking around, and they say, somebody's been eating my porridge. Somebody's been eating my porridge, and mine's all gone. They go upstairs. Somebody's been sleeping in my bed. Somebody's been sleeping in my bed. Third one, somebody's been sleeping in my bed, and they're still here. You know, it reminds me of stories where people go into a house and are squatters in houses and take up residence in somebody's house and stay there and do whatever they want in somebody's house. In Mexico, that happens all the time. If you don't have somebody living in your house, anybody can just come into your house, take up residency, and they're the owners of that house. Goldilocks, while she was in need, still came into the house, took what she needed, and went in there. And so as we look at these verses today, we see 2 things I want to talk about Jesus Christ. We see his passion here. And we see that in the verses. We see it here in the verses. It says, John chapter 2, 13 to 17 says, the Jewish Passover was near. And so Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found people selling oxen, sheep, doves. He also found the money changers sitting there. And after making a whip out of cords, he drove everyone out of the temple with their sheep and oxen. And he poured out the money changers' coins, overturned the tables. And he told those who were selling doves, get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace. And his disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. And so Jesus, with his disciples, goes up to Jerusalem. And as they get into Jerusalem, and he's been there before, he goes and he sees a sight that he's seen before, and it infuriates him. He doesn't sin, because his anger doesn't lead to sin. But nonetheless, he is angry at the sight that he sees. And one of the things I ask myself is, why is he mad? Why is he mad? And he gives us that he's mad because of the money changers. And we look at it and we think, okay, well, that's obvious. You know, people selling and making money in the house of God, you know, that's just inappropriate, right? But I sat there and as I was studying for the message, I said, there's more to it than just that. And I want to get deeper into it. Why, Jesus? Why were you so infuriated at what you saw? What was it? Was it just the animals, which at one point in time, think about it, if you're traveling from far away, you can't bring your own lamb. You can't bring your own animals if you're coming from overseas. You have to have a place to buy your offering. So what was wrong with it? And if you're a foreigner, if you're coming in from out of town like many Jewish people did, you had currency of another country. They had what they called a temple tax that was used to take care of the temple, to take care of the needs of the temple. What was wrong with providing an ability for people to trade in their foreign currency for a currency that was acceptable for the temple? I mean, Jesus, whenever he went to the temple, he would pay a tax for it. What was it that he saw that day that infuriated him on this day? And again, 3 years later. What was it he saw? So I put together a display for you guys. I want you to look at it closely. So if you look up here, you see the holy place, which is where God would have been, which he hasn't been in a long time. He's left. Before Babylon, he left. That's where the Ark of the Covenant would have been, which is no longer there. You have the slaughter tables there, which is where they would make the offerings, the sheep offerings and everything. You have the altar. You have the different gates to get in. You have the women's courtyard. You have, as you've seen in the Bible, the beautiful gate where people would enter. Chamber of Nazarites. But if you notice something all around the outside of the temple, it's called the Gentiles' courtyard. And that's where all of this bazaar would have happened. The animals would have been placed all around the outside of this temple for people to come in and just purchase the animals that they needed. Well, if you're a Gentile, which is somebody that is not a Jewish person, they could go no farther than the Gentile courtyard. So let's imagine if you were showing up that day and you're a foreigner and you have nothing, ability to get any further in, but all you could see are people of this Jewish race sitting there selling animals in front of what was described as God's house. And people turning it into this marketplace, this bazaar, making money. The high priest, they were famous, the particular high priest was famous for turning this place into a marketplace to make money. In 62 AD, I believe, 63 AD, there's a revolt against him because of it. People so infuriated from it. And so it wasn't just Jesus that was upset. But if you had no idea about this religion, and you saw that, what would you think? You see, God had used that Gentile courtyard as a place to display for himself to all the world who he is. And here they are, blocking it out and turning it into something it should never have been. And the Gentiles, when they get to see it, they don't see what it was meant to be. That's one of the reasons why Jesus was so mad. Because the people that should have been able to see who Jesus Christ, who God the Father is, couldn't see it. People were getting in the way. People were making money. People were doing everything they shouldn't have been doing. Why else was Jesus mad? Why else? Well, I told you when they came in from a foreign country, these people had to have money to pay the temple tax. A right kind of money, a right amount of money. And they just didn't have it on them. They had to have a place to change it. Come, the money changers. Instead of, when God created this system of sacrifice, He created it where anybody could sacrifice. Even the poor could sacrifice. He made it available where people could sacrifice even birds. He made it available for everybody. But you know what these guys were doing? These money changers, they were saying, okay, to pay this temple tax, you got to have the right kind of money. So we'll exchange it for you, but we're going to charge you a large percentage on interest. They were making a killing at it. And most of the people that had to do it were probably poor people. And the poor people were getting poorer, just paying the temple tax and paying for the sacrifices that they had to give. Not only that, there was a monopoly on the sacrifices. There was a monopoly on all this. I came across this excerpt, and excuse me, I do want to kind of read it to kind of give you an idea. And it talks about how the upkeep of the sanctuary is paid for, but it talks about more than that. So I'll try to do my best to get through it fast, but it gives you an idea of what was going on. According to the law God given to Moses, everyone who enrolled in the census, it's usually an annual census by the time Jesus was there, was to pay a tax to maintain the sanctuary. At Moses' time, this was where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. In Jesus' time, the sanctuary was the second temple in Jerusalem. And the law is specific. Everyone who is enrolled must pay a half shekel, according to the standard of the sanctuary shekel. A half shekel at that time of Jesus was equal to 160 grains of barley, about an 1/8 gram of silver, according to one of the rabbis. In our standard back in 2021, it'd be about $7. So in our standards, it wouldn't be too much. But in the time of Jesus, silver was rare. It was very rare. The weight of barley was an easy exchange rate in the first century. Jerusalem was the crossroads of culture and under the control of Roman Empire. So as Roman subject country, Palestine was not technically allowed to mint its own money as it had when Israel was independent. So around the time Jesus was a teenager, the standard Tyrrhenian shekel, known for its consistent weight and silver content, was changed out for coins from farther east that had less silver content. So in Jesus' day, people paid the temple tax, and the price for animal sacrifices was all sorts of coinage, including the inferior shekel. And the priests of the temple needed to be certain that they got the proper half shekel equivalent out of everyone. So it's a matter of maintaining the proper standard. We know that the second temple, which is Herod's temple that he expanded on, included the court of the Gentiles, which separated the rest of the temple by the large gallery, which you can see up there. And during the holy day feasts, such as Passover, attracted pilgrims from all around the Mediterranean. And the temple priests set up stalls in the gallery area, which was known as the royal stoa. And these stalls would include sacrificial animals. Because while a person could bring their own lambs or pigeons, as Joseph probably did, they needed to meet a certain standard of purity. And if the priest found the animals were not acceptable, the proper offering needed to be purchased. So you see where things can start getting shady here? You see where they can start using their own judgment sometimes to make money? So between selling the animals and exchanging the money, business was big. Money changers were a necessary fixture. Not only that, but the temple was also known as a local bank. It became a local bank. Jerusalem was such a crossroads, the temple became a bank where the rich would store their money. And there were actually money vaults built into the temple where people could house their treasuries. And since the temple had its own guard, it made it a safe place to store the riches. And like I said, Jesus wasn't the only one upset at all this. The family of the high priest Anna was known to control much of the business bazaars in the temple area. They became so disliked for their business practices that they were overthrown by the general uprising in 67 AD. Came to an end. And you could see why Jesus was so upset at this point. Because people just can't see God and worship God the way they're supposed to because of all the stuff going on. It was said that a few years earlier, $20 million was stolen and taken out of here. Didn't even make a dent in what they had. This is the kind of money we're talking about that they made. Millions of people coming in, having to do business here. And Jesus, when he saw it, was angry. How would that make you feel? Make you feel angry, wouldn't it? Make you feel angry if you had to walk in, purchase something because your item didn't meet the standards. And then when you purchased it, you had to pay a tax, which you were going to do anyway, but then you had to, if you didn't have the right coinage, pay interest on it. If you went to a church like that today, what would you think? How would it make you feel? You talk about churches that want to, talk about getting money out of you. Look at this. No wonder Jesus was so mad. Because worship wasn't worship anymore. It had become a big business. God was overlooked. And he was mad. And you know what he did? He goes in there. He takes the place where the money changers are, sitting right there, grabs it, grabs the tables where they're at, throws them and flips them. Strong man to do that. And as he's doing that, these temple guards probably are put on notice, the security forces. The Sanhedrin, which are the members of the high priest, or some there, people probably come and look to see what's going on. What is disrupting our business? And here is Jesus driving everyone out, including the animals, because he's tired of people not being able to see God for who he is and to worship the way God had intended it. If you loved God the way Jesus did, you would be mad too. And he was mad. And the disciples, when they saw all this, think back to this verse, Psalm 69:9. Because zeal for your house has consumed me, and the insults of who insult you have fallen on me. It's a psalm written by David. And this particular verse, he's considered this righteous sufferer, the only one that is standing in the gap of how God should be worshiped. And he knows that if he stands up to those people around him, something's going to happen. He's going to pay the price for standing up. And he feels alone. And that's why when the disciples reflect back on Jesus Christ and look back, they can see the beginning of what David was talking about. This righteous sufferer, because the zeal for God and his house was consumed, and the insults of the high priest, the marketplace, the money exchangers have fallen on him. And it was only going to be a matter of time before they get rid of him because of what he has done. That's why 69:9 is there. Because they saw the Messiah there in that verse as the one that's going to come in and change the religious practices, stand up for the people. And they weren't the only ones that were aware of that. Look at the following verses. Let's look at what Jesus says. In John 2:18-22. It says, so the Jews replied to him, what sign will you show us for doing these things? It's the promise of Jesus. If you have your notes there, it's the promise of Jesus. What sign? They knew the verse. These security guards, the Sanhedrin, the people that came up to him. You've done all this. By what authority do you think you're doing what you're doing? We know by what you just did, you are claiming to be the Messiah. What authority do you have to do what you just did? To prove yourself, give us a sign. Because they were wanting a sign. They wanted evidence that demanded the sign for how you have the authority to do what you just did. What authority do you have to do what you just did, to come in and kick us out? What authority do you have to do what you just did? And Jesus says this, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll bring it back. And they're looking at him like, you fool. Don't you realize it took more than 3 days to build this temple? 46 years. It took 46 years. It took years to build, and then Herod had to expand upon it. You fool, you can't bring this temple back in 3 days. You can't bring it back. But he wasn't speaking of that. You want your sign? Destroy this temple. When he says temple, the body is often referred to as a temple. He said, destroy this body. And in 3 days, it will come back. His disciples at that time didn't even know what he was talking about. They had no idea. It says at the end of this verse that it wasn't until after they saw him that they remembered what he just said. You want a sign? You're going to have to wait 3 years for it. But here's your sign. This body, and in 3 days it's going to come back. And they missed it. I just wonder If some of those people listening to what Jesus' answer was then, when they crucified him on the cross, when they watched him being crucified on a cross, if they're sitting there thinking, you remember that first time he came in and he drove out the money changers and he whipped the people out of there and he made the animals get out of there and he interrupted our business as usual? I wonder if he knew he was going to get this today. And in 3 days, the reports started coming out. The rock from his tomb has been rolled away. He's not in there. I wonder if some of them started thinking back, just as the disciples. He says he's going to raise that temple up in 3 days. Maybe he wasn't talking about the temple. Maybe he was talking about himself. Maybe he was going to be the one. You know, most people are like this. They always want signs. They always want signs. Hey, you're telling me something so unbelievable. You're doing something so unbelievable. Give me a sign. Give me a sign. I wonder if that's why Jesus said to have faith in him, you got to come like a little child. You know, when I think about little children, they don't ask for signs. They don't ask for a bunch of signs to believe. You tell them, and they believe. Most kids will believe you if you tell them because they think you're honest. They think you care. They have no reason to ask for a sign. They think you're telling the truth. And Jesus says, you have to have faith as a child. Childs don't need signs to believe. They don't need signs. But Jesus says, you destroy this temple, in 3 days he'll come back. That's your sign. You want a sign? You got it. And they all missed it. You know, when I really, really look at this, I think about Jesus' own example and testimony are presented as evidence that he's the Christ. His example and his testimony are evidence enough that he's the Christ, the Messiah. His zeal, his want for worship, those are the signs. Those are all the evidence that we need. But you know, there's a couple things I want us to remember. One, I want you to remember the resurrection. Remember the resurrection, because the resurrection is our hope. It's the promise that turns our faith from vain to invaluable. When seeds of doubt begin to take root, remember the promise Jesus made that he would conquer death and the grave. Read the testimony of Scripture to understand that he is who he says he is. The risen Christ, just as he said. You know, John's writing this so you'll believe. He gives us an account so people will believe. And that's why he throws in the temple explanation. But the other thing is this, and I think all of us can remember this. Recognize that God's temple is sacred. Now, I'm not talking about this place we worship in or that temple in Jerusalem. I'm talking about this. I'm talking about this. I'm talking about you. I'm talking about your body. This instant that we see includes practical truths for all of us, for all believers. God's temple is sacred ground and is a dedicated place of meeting between you and God. In the Old Testament, God used this physical building, this structure, this tabernacle that was to house this tent of meeting. There was a permanent building in Jerusalem. But Jesus was specific about reserving everything in the temple for the purpose of worship. And then once Jesus completed his work on the cross, the atonement and the sacrifice for sin, for the world, that place of meeting changed. But you know what didn't change? The standards. The standards that Jesus set on that temple remain the same. They remain the same for every believer, because you're now the temple. 1 Corinthians 6:19 and 20 tell us that. And we're no less to remain sanctified. Jesus provided the example. When we think about it, the Gentile court, how's your example to the Gentiles out there? Is it a marketplace? Is it a place where they come in, people look, I can't even see God in there? Or is it cleared out, displaying the glory of God? How's your temple today? Jesus sets the example. And he wants all of us to follow it. He set the standard. Let's live by it. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, we thank you for this scene in John that we have. This temple cleaning. And while we look at it as this temple cleaning event, it's much deeper. It goes a lot deeper.